Okay, hi everyone. It's Antonio Galoni, Friday afternoon. Welcome to Vinous Live. I'm absolutely thrilled to have the whole VHR Vine Hill Ranch team, proprietor Bruce Phillips, winemaker Françoise Peschon, and vineyard manager Mike Wolf. Thanks so much for all of you being here at the same time. It's kind of a miracle of scheduling. We were able to do this, but I'm absolutely delighted to have you, and I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. So tell us a little bit about the history of the ranch and of your family.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of folks that have been here longer than my family has. My family were the newcomers in the late 50s and came to this valley and purchased this property. Actually, my grandfather brought us to Vine Hill Ranch. It was a much more sizable holding at the time, but purchased roughly 1,200 acres here in the Oakville appellation back in 56. And very different time then. But as Antonio's now flipping to the map, Vine Hill Ranch rises from the benchlands on the western slope of the Mayacamas to the ridge tops above. We farm a little over 70 acres, almost entirely Cabernet Sauvignon at this time. But over the years, we've grown just about every Bordeaux variety in this vineyard. But I guess my family's had the great fortune of partnering with a number of great vintners through the years and been here at a time when this valley really came into its own. And I think we continue to evolve, but through the 60s, 70s, and the 90s was a remarkable evolution in this valley, both as growers, which we have been now for 3 generations, but also as vintners, which is a relatively new iteration for my family.
Yeah, so we can see we're at the southern end of Oakville here, with your neighbors, Missouri Hopper, right as you drive into your gate, Christian Moex's property, the new one, and so this is a very distinctive, I think, part of Oakville itself. I mean, this is the map of Oakville that we did in 2016, which is now being updated, and even within Oakville, there's tremendous diversity. On the right, we can see the block breakdown. We'll get into that in a second. I'm curious though, Mike, you farm like a number of really unbelievable vineyards like Scarecrow and Kelly Fleming and just a numerous list of vineyards. What is it about, obviously Martinez on Pritchard Hill, what is it about Vine Hill Ranch from a viticultural perspective that is unique to you?
I think it's a couple of big things, Antonio. I mean, one is just the physical location in the valley. It's far enough north so that it's just kind of on the edge of the cooling influence of the bay, but not overwhelmed by it. So there's ample opportunity to get Cabernet fully ripe that sometimes we struggle with a little bit farther to the south. I think the other thing that's really, really important in terms of location is that it's on the west side of the valley with the Mayacamas behind it. And one thing that doesn't get talked about quite often enough was the fact that Bruce's family over the generations, and now Bruce and Heather continuing that, have really preserved the woodlands behind the vineyard. And they have a tremendous impact on the land, on the quality of the fruit, also the different nature of the fruit. When you've tasted the different lots from the vineyard, that from the blocks up against the hill have very, very different character than the benchlands. The other thing that is sort of irreplaceable, and in the breadth of what we do in the valley, I don't know of another site with the consistency of soil as you go down through the soil profile. We've dug a lot of holes here over the years for different reasons, some just purely exploratory, some to put in drainage systems, for a bunch of different reasons. But although there's some significant variability over the 70 acres, in any one spot, you don't find a lot of layers as you go down through the soil. And I think that gives the roots of the vines the ability to explore in a really kind of a nice, uniform way, that they're not hitting gravel at a certain point. And it kind of, then you need to tweak your irrigation stuff differently. There's a stability to the site that that I think is pretty unique to the valley.
Yeah, so to that point of the mountains, I wanted to show you this image. It has a typo on the bottom, so don't look at that. But this is just a draft that Alessandro Masnaghetti, my colleague and our extraordinary cartographer, was playing with. Literally just, I mean, he literally sent it to me like 2 hours ago. So it's not at all like we're showing, this is like a wine from a barrel. It's like not ready. It's just like a little bit of something that we're playing around with. But I think that I was talking with Bruce and Françoise, Mike, before you joined, before we went on the air. This to me is one of the best things I've seen that really shows the transition from more sort of bench vineyards into more hillside vineyards. And you can see these plots here, you know, that's like nestled into the mountains. And until Alessandro sent me this picture, I don't think I'd ever seen such a really neat aerial representation of this site. This is an aerial photograph from 1948, so it's obviously very different from today, but I thought that this was really telling here, this area here, that you could really see, where the hillside parcels start. And you're on the border with Yountville, basically to the south. Because Bruce, your family also owned a lot of the land in what is now Promontory, right, over the years? I mean, the ranch itself is much bigger than just the actual vineyard.
Yeah, the ranch itself extends to the ridgetops behind the vineyard, but yeah, what is now Bill Harlan's Promontory Vineyard was part of the original purchase. It was roughly 1,200 acres in size. He sold that to a good friend, and the family continues to farm the Embar Ranch to our south, the Moffett family. But and then through various ownership now, Bill is stewarding that site forward up at the top of Promontory.
Yeah. So, and then, Françoise, I'm not ignoring you.
Oh no, I like it this way.
Obviously,
when I took a look at your map, I was just amazed to see this perspective and how Block 6, you know, which ones we're talking about, are just cradled in this forest. And
yeah.
Those are really the signature blocks. But the forest has such an imprint on the wines from those 3 blocks. Yeah.
And that is, I mean, you know, one of the tastings that I love doing the most is the tasting where you show the new, obviously this year it wasn't possible because, you know, there's kind of like this pandemic, but ordinarily I would come and see you in the spring around April, and we would taste the new vintage, and you always show all the different blocks, including the ones that are the heart of your wine. You only make one, I mean, you sell fruit to a number of vineyards, but Vinehill VHR, your own winery, only makes one wine. And that's one of the core components, right? The different 6 blocks. And so Françoise, how did you get involved with making this wine in the beginning?
Well, the first vintage was 2008, and Bruce got a great story how he and Mike finally wore down Bob Phillips in bringing forward a wine. And at the time I was still working at the Isley Vineyard, and Bart and Daphne Arajo were really good friends with Bob and Alex. So I think it was actually Mike Wolf who said, she might be interested in this. So, yeah.
And so then
2008, that was kind of a tricky year. Between the economic downturn, frost season, fires, drought, a lot of different things were going on. And even Bruce said, should we really start making a wine now? And it's like, yes, we should. And I tend to like the more challenging vintages. I think they make for really interesting wines that capture the essence of that vintage.
Yeah. So had you made any wines before 2008 as a trial, or was 2008 really the beginning?
2008 was the beginning, yeah. But we had so much experience from these individual blocks. The Phillips would taste wines in the vineyard. You know, we're in this block and we're drinking Etudes Cabernet, or this block and we're drinking the Benchlands from Cakebread. So we really learned about the attributes from these different blocks through the wines that were made. And VHR is a little bit different. We don't source from, you know, one or two blocks. It's really the whole ranch that we want to represent in the blend.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I remember when I first tasted the 2008, you know, a lot of times people say that like, oh, you know, you can't, after you taste a number of wines, like you can't understand anything and you're tired and blah, 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 blah. It's one of the things that people say a lot of people like me who taste a lot of wine. But I actually like very much tasting at the end of the day. I feel like you're really in the zone, really focused. And I remember the first time I tasted this 2008 was after this big long tasting with well over 100 wines. I don't remember Kimberly Jones's house. I remember it was Halloween because she had like a whole house full of like Halloween like ghouls. I guess some of them were things that Bob Parker had sent, but they were like, it was all this like ghoulish Halloween stuff outside. And at the end, she's like, I've got this new wine. You have to try this wine. It's the first vintage. And I was like, okay, of course. And that was it. And that was 2008. And I remember, and obviously within the context of Napa Valley, your wine, Françoise, your wines have always been, you know, a little bit more towards the, I hate the word restrained, but, you know, the less obviously flamboyant, opulent style.
I love that word.
You do? Okay, fine. Your wines have always been more on the restrained side. And so, but even after tasting all of those wines, including a lot of wines that were high octane, there was just something really special about that wine. So it's fun to hear you talk about the growing season, because I don't think I've ever been asked you about that, but that wine is obviously a really unique wine.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the blocks, and here's the block breakdown of the property. And so, Mike, tell us a little bit about you said that the soil is pretty much the same, but I mean, you know, I've been to some of these parcels with you. There's that parcel that has like the moon dust. There's the mountain parcels. I mean, it's pretty diverse though, isn't it? I mean, to make this.
Yeah, I may have misspoken, Antonio. What I meant was in any given spot on the ranch, there's this tremendous uniformity in the depth of the profile at that spot, but there's clearly a huge difference as you go across the ranch and up and down the ranch. You know, you go all the way from fairly deep soils on block 2 along Hopper Creek and kind of the lowest reaches of the vineyard, all the way through that moon dust soil, which is block 6A, which is kind of right in there, where there's a lot of rhyolite, which we just don't find even in little pieces in other parts of the vineyard. It's just very much concentrated there. It seems to bleed over a little bit into block 1D onto the hillside block, the young hillside block, where there seems like there's a strip of it that goes through there. Then as you move across, you get into the 6s, which are, you know, and just have a profound forest influence, a lot of organic matter in the soil without the soil being heavy. And then the little purple block farthest to the northwest has a real creek bed kind of influence. So it's very unique to the ranch as well. And that, you know, that kind of played into the whole principle of the wine, of saying, you know, give Françoise all of the tools that the ranch can provide. Maybe or maybe not in any given year they all make it into the blend, but the concept was more of showing the entirety of the ranch in the wine, as opposed to our other winery partners who are just getting, you know, sometimes fairly small amounts of fruit from a very specific spot in a very specific block. You know, so for them, it's a little different. You know, that's their wine. Here, the blending potential is pretty huge, and really one of the most interesting and fun parts of the whole winemaking process is when Françoise starts putting all of those together and making believe that the rest of us have input into what it winds up being.
I have to disagree with that. I think, the blending process is always really fun, but we're growing this blend. And these initial 1 acre carve outs were selected by Mike and Bruce and Bob before I got there. So I already, I had my marching orders. These are 1 acre carve outs and these blocks. We know that this is kind of the sweet spot. So, and the intention was that they were tools in a toolbox. And we, from there identified which were the ones that had different attributes. I mean, 6 is definitely the foundation of the wine. It just speaks of the forest. It's very dense, brooding. It's the foundation piece, where we work in the other ones for aromatics or for energy, that racy quality that we get on the benchlands. But it's not that we make blends. I think we grow them by selecting which blocks represent the truest nature of Vine Hill Ranch.
Yeah, and I mean, you really humiliated me last time because you gave me the 2018s to blend, and it should have been impossible to you made me make a horrendous wine with really great components, because your wine, of course, was fantastic. But when you said here are the components, you tried blending it. It was a disaster.
Oh,
so
it was fun. You did very well.
That was pretty humbling, I have to say. How could you not how could you do that to these components? Well, it's possible.
Yeah, and I'll have to say, even the blocks have changed. We have 12 harvests of Vine Hill under the belt, and our oldest blocks are like 28 years, and blocks that I considered kind of young ones, like block 4, the benchlands, they're not young anymore, so they're also changing. So
which one just cut out of
fruit, I think of it as fresh, high-tone fruit, but it's becoming more broody, and it's coming into its own in its 20th year.
Which one, though?
Both benchland blocks, so our block 4 and 3B, their roles kind of change a little bit as they're evolving.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably the most exciting part of the ranch. I don't know that we'll ever take out block 5. We're not replanting blocks in their entirety so much anymore. Like block 6, we're doing a lot of roguing, replanting, because you can't grow another 25-year-old vineyard, My harvests are kind of numbered. So that's been exciting to have a vineyard within a vineyard and to really preserve the beauty of those old vines.
So Mike, one of the things that I always observe about your vineyards as opposed to, let's say, the vineyards that are farmed by some of your colleagues is you don't stress the vineyards as is the philosophy from some other people. You don't really believe in training very low to the ground. I think unless you've changed your view, you're anti-shade cloth. So Mike, what are the principal tenets of how you think a Napa Valley vineyard should be farmed?
Well, I think it needs to fit comfortably into its site. And I think, if we want to talk just about this property, which I think is what we should do, from the farmer's perspective, this is a really easy ranch to farm. This is such a great site that the guiding principle truly is to not screw it up. And I think a lot of the things that I think of as heroic viticulture are really not appropriate here. What we're looking for here are resilient vines that can handle stressful situations, whether that's lack of rainfall, which we're blessed on this property with good groundwater resources. We can supplement that. We try to grow canopies that provide their own shade. I mean, I think some of the heroic stuff, if you need to do that, you probably need to be thinking about whether you should be growing grapes there. We want the vines, and I have a really strong belief that if you get that stuff right, and you have resilient vines that are strong without being overly vigorous, they're going to make wine that's more expressive of the site. They become part of the site. They're not just something that's plunked down on it. And again, this is a fairly easy vineyard to do that in because the soil is so uniform as you go through it, you know, from spot to spot, and it just all fits. I mean, there's the oldest vines on the ranch, which that photograph is showing in block 6. They're big vines. It's sort of this unique training system that Tony Soter had come up with when he was consulting for Bruce's dad, and they were developing that piece. And when I first looked at it, we started working with Bob in 1998, and when I first looked at it, I totally did not understand it. It looked like it had way too many growing points. It just didn't look right to me. And Bruce's dad was a really wise man. And he said, you know, you might want to just kind of look at it for a couple of years before you do anything. And I think a lot of the farming that we do, whether it's on Vine Hill Ranch or any of the other properties that we take care of, tries to emulate the fruit exposure that comes from that canopy in block 6, which is just kind of this nice dappled light. The fruit zone is open. You get really good airflow. You get really good penetration with fungicides if you need to use them. And it's not manicured. If there's anything that I dislike more than shade cloth, it's probably tying individual shoots. These are vines. They need to be vines, and it's with that kind of architecture of the trellis system and the way we prune and sucker and train the vines to fit it. You can get that while still allowing the vines to be vines. You get an awful lot of control over the light regime while not doing things that just don't come naturally to grapevines.
So Bruce, I mean, obviously your family started by selling grapes, and then now you've transitioned to making wine over the arc of the decades. How have you seen the evolution of Napa Valley in that time? It's a pretty interesting time with a lot of dynamicism.
Oh, I think when we first started, there were under 20 vintners in this valley, and today there's arguably, you've got to be approaching 1,000 producing or branding entities out there. Vintners alone has almost 600 members. So the market has evolved in remarkable ways. Wines are being made and sourced in entirely different ways now. And before, the toolbox was valley-wide and comprised of multiple varieties to make big meritage blends that this valley's reputation began to be established on. And really, the 90s, really things started to change, and there was more of a site-based approach, more winemakers making smaller lots, and increasingly to today, where we find ourselves being very much site-focused and exploring what particular sites like my family's vineyard can deliver around a particular variety, which to me is tremendously exciting, and I think is certainly the future of this valley. There's so many sites to explore across so many varieties in this very varied appellation. And Vine Hill Ranch is an example. I mean, we're still primarily growers. We have 11 vintners alongside us here with VHR this season, each bringing their own creative eye to interpret particular blocks expression of variety. And I don't know, I guess the one thing that hasn't been said, Mike mentioned Tony Soder, but so many winemakers have had an imprint here at Vinehill, and we benefited certainly from their interpretation of this fruit. And it gave us, as the thing reflecting on when Françoise talked about our sourcing from all the different blocks, we had a bit of a leg up in that we had a lot of perspective on what various areas of the vineyard could deliver to finished blends, because we've tasted over the years with so many great winemakers and gained an understanding of this vineyard.
So how often would you, like if you have 11 people buying fruit this year, how often would you have a chance to sit down and taste all of the wines made off the ranch, like let's say in a single vintage?
Well, age-old practice. I mean, it's not as common now as it once was. In the spring, you taste the prior harvests in blend, and you have a conversation about what went right last year and what we could have improved. And with that, you gained an inherent trust, and you move down a line to continually improve quality. That's largely the practice this year with the body of our vintners, and it's a remarkable exercise because it builds alignment around, from a grower standpoint through to what they're trying to achieve in the cellar, and you're in partnership to continually improve your practice in both fronts. So it's that perspective year over year, 60 years of gathering with vintner and grower to talk about how we can continually improve our practice to facilitate those wines that brought us ultimately to want to make our own wine. That's expressive of the entirety of the vineyard, as Mike was speaking to earlier.
And does each of your partner vintners, do they each get to have input on how they want the vineyard farmed and their harvest dates and all irrigation and all that? Or is it, I mean, that must be pretty complicated to handle all of that. So what's the secret?
I think I'll let Mike respond, but I think the secret is building trust. And over time, and the average term of our relationships at this point is about 15 years. And the longest is crossing over to 40 this year. Over the course of 30 to 40 seasons, you start to learn what people's expectations are, and you start to understand how you're going to farm together. And that's important. So I'll let Mike speak more specifically to tactically how it works on the ground.
Yeah, I think Bruce is right in that a lot of it is about trust, but I also believe that we need to earn people's trust, and we work really hard to do that. We want their input, certainly. We want them to let us know what they're looking for, and going through the wines with them is always really, really instructive. In that, we meet with them during the season as much as they want to, but at the end of the day, we're responsible for the final result. And it is a really, really fine line to walk. And without singling anyone out or without pointing any fingers at anyone, there are some things, there are some requests that winemakers might make that the answer would simply be no. We don't just do everything that they want to do. We're happy to discuss stuff. We're happy to explain why we're doing it. But at the end of the day, we have to do what we think is best for the vineyard. And we hope very much that judgment makes it best for everybody's wine. And the longevity of the relationships is hugely important. We kind of know what people want, and the consistency of them coming back to the same blocks or even the same rows within a block year after year after year. it's not that difficult to sort of fine tune our practices towards them. And I think it really is fine tuning. It's not this radical change in what we do from one winery to the other. And again, it's about expressing the vineyard. It's not about laying a heavy hand on it to make it fit into some arbitrary square peg or round hole. So, and I think overall our winemaking partners are happy with that. I mean, they may want to have a little bit more control in certain cases, but that's just kind of not the way we do it here.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I love really more than anything is being in the valley in September and October and tasting a lot of wine. The wines from your vineyard that other people vinify that are in their blends, you know, and some people are a little bit more private, and some people are maybe a little bit more open in terms of sort of how much they necessarily might want me to talk about it. But it's just always fascinating to go to some other winery, one of your neighbors, and taste a Vine Hill Ranch that's going to be either bottled on its own or a component, because it's I think one of the most fun parts of tasting wine is seeing the embryonic pieces as they come together, both at your place and at other places. I'm curious, Françoise, so much of your career has been associated with Islay Vineyard. So how are there between Islay Vineyard and Vine Hill Ranch, which I think most people would place at the upper echelon of vineyards in Napa Valley, are they more similar or are they more different?
More similar in quality. Islay Vineyard, climactically, it was a little bit more dramatic. But the wines from that site, you know, those, again, another alluvial fan, but a lot rockier. And the wines were more on the elegant side than the power that you get from Vine Hill.
And do you think that is like a soil issue or the location of Calistoga?
I mean, the Cabernets that come from Calistoga do have that open, more high-tone fruit quality. Certainly the gravelly soils, though, I think influence the texture of those wines, just as Vine Hill with these really deep soils give a much more kind of brooding, more tightly knit quality. Yeah, two great sites.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think that I have to tell you, quite honestly, for me, it's been such an education to learn about these vineyards because there's so much diversity. And in Napa Valley, we were just talking about two vineyards, but I mean, there's many others. Some of them may be in the same level, some of them maybe not, but the diversity of places, I mean, wow, it's so complex, but in the very best way, because, you know, you're always a student. So
one similarity that both sites do have is this afternoon cooling. For Islay Vineyard, it was the Chalk Hill Gap that just like clockwork, the breeze comes in and it kind of moves all that warm air, brings in the moisture. And as you can hear from Bruce, every afternoon you get that same wind flow from the San Pablo. Yeah. So a lot of sites, but really great cooling, and then the effect of that moisture.
Yeah. I mean, Vine Hill Ranch is one of the most bucolic places in Napa Valley. I have to say, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of going at various times of the year for various reasons. It could be a 5 a.m. harvest or to taste or whatever, but it's a hard place to drive away from, regardless. So tell us about this wine, which you sent me. This is a 2013 Vine Hill VHR. I love this vintage. I knew from the very beginning for its power. This is obviously one of the wines made in the drought cycle of 12, 13, 14, 15, I guess 16 and 16 would be included in that too. But Bruce, what was it about 13 that you remember in the season that made this wine the way it is right now?
Well, we were talking about what wine we could all enjoy together. So we all have this 13 with us today. But the reason we selected this vintage to send to you was in the vineyard today, and we're contemplating with early bud break this year and fairly average, maybe average plus crop. What vintage within VHR's realm could we likely compare it to, given where we are in this state of the season? And 13 was a relatively early set, September harvest, where this one will likely fall in. And so we thought, well, we might as well, why don't we take an opportunity to revisit this vintage? Mike and I were chatting about 13 before we got on this call, and I guess the thing about the vintage is that it really didn't have a lot of speed bumps. 12 was remarkably easy and warm. I'd say 13 had a little more variability in terms of climatologically, heat and cooling. Then 12 was very uniform, sort of temperate and warm. But there wasn't any real problems associated with the 13. And I guess from a farming standpoint, you're always looking for what issues might have come forward in the year. So that's why we chose it for this. As we sit here today, the vineyard seems to be handling this very well. We've had very little rainfall this year. We're just over 50% of our annual average at this point. But canopies are setting wonderfully. The crop is moving through bloom. It appears to be, again, anything can happen between now and September, but so far, everything is falling in nicely. So we sent some images to show you where the crop is, and I see you put some up right here.
Yeah, so this is bloom, and at this stage, there's some unevenness in the berries, in the berries, quote unquote. But will that even out over time? I mean, or is this a vintage where there may be some difference in berry sizes?
Mike, you want to speak to that?
Yeah. Well, we're not quite through with set yet. And some of what you're seeing there is probably not going to stick, but there is, I mean, that's not a real dramatic difference in berry size, and probably by the end of the season, it won't be one of those situations where there's a lot of chicks and hens and, big berries and small berries and lots of variation in ripening within the cluster. I mean, it's not so much about the size that's important. It's about how uniformly they ripen, because as the most uniform vineyard in the world has a huge amount of variation in it, and the final maturity, whatever winds up in the bottle or in the tank, is an average. And I think the goal is always, to make the average be closer to both extremes than, I mean, just to pick an arbitrary number, you'd like to harvest at 26 bricks. You'd rather have that be an average between 25 and 27 than 30 and 22.
Sure.
And so it's about how the clusters ripen ultimately. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about a little bit of difference in size at this particular point.
I think I have to tell you that in the 2 months that we've been doing these sort of conversations like this, I've found it an unbelievably incredible education for me. It's been unbelievable to be able to talk to people when there's not the pressure of having to taste necessarily a lot of wines, or like the next appointment, or you're wondering if you're going to be late or how late, in my case, because I'm always late. But and it's just been really educational. I think one of the really interesting things about the difference in culture is that, in a lot of parts of the world, a slight variation is considered actually a positive. It's about complexity, as you're saying, whereas maybe in some of your colleagues in the Valley, sometimes there's an obsession with like this perfect grape that looks like a blueberry, blah, 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 blah. And, I'm not sure that necessarily translates into a complex wine over time. I mean, it may be fantastic in the immediate. But there's a lot of parts in the world, probably most of them, where some degree of variation is actually considered, a good thing. I don't, you maybe not want that extreme that you mentioned, 22 to 30, but a more narrow average or a more narrow band is probably a good thing. But I just think it's interesting to hear different people espouse different philosophies in different parts of the world. It's just an incredible education. So that's
I was just thinking about how equipment has also changed. I'm looking at this cluster, there might be some shot berries and thinking, oh, well, the sorting will take care of that. Those will drop through. But you bring up a really good point, and that is the importance of uniformity. And are you taking character away? So I don't have a problem with having some shot berries or some stems. It gives the wine character.
Well, in Burgundy, shot berries are usually the sign of
it becomes simple.
Yeah. I'm curious. I hate to bombard you with really geeky questions, but what is the clonal mix at Vine Hill Ranch?
It's not real extensive, Antonio. The benchlands is largely clone 4. A lot of it is on 10114 rootstock, which corresponds to the little bit deeper soil, a little bit higher moisture holding capacity of the soil. As we work our way up the hill, we kind of transition a little bit to mostly clone 7 on 3309 rootstock. And Françoise could speak better than I to the wine, but I think that's really the star on the ranch, and that really is the core of the wine. It's a little bit not well, I guess tilted is the right word. It's a little bit tilted based on the site as you move up the hill, and on the vine age as you move into the block 6, those being the oldest vines on the property. We in the Moondust block, what we call the Moondust block, which is the really kind of anomaly of soil on the property where there is a lot of rhyolite. When we replanted it, we were all interested in doing something a little bit different. So we planted St. George there and put Clone 7 on that as well, kind of a Napa Valley classic combination. And the wines are pretty remarkable, and they are different, and it's still young vine fruit, but I think that's going to be something really, really special. We've got a little bit of 337 also on the property, which is mostly on 3309. We just replanted 9.5 acres this spring, and it was a real interesting conversation about what to put there. The site pretty much screams for 3309, and we were all pretty much in agreement with that. And then we had the Clonal conversation, and Françoise was the one with the strongest opinion that, Clone 7 really is Vine Hill Ranch. We've developed, we're sort of focused in on our own source of budwood on the property that comes from block 6. So it's sort of become a Vine Hill selection that we've gravitated towards, and we're doing that as we move forward. We did one little different thing in block 5, really for the sake of another tool in the toolbox. Is we planted a little bit of Clone 6, which is typically not a grower's clone. It can be very, very shy yielding, but typically can be a really important component in wine, but it's very difficult for growers to do it if they're selling grapes. So we did it specifically with the intention of giving Françoise that to play with VHR, and we put it on 428, rootstock, which tends to be more fruitful, in the hope that it can overcome some of the clone 6 issues where it tends to be a little bit less fruitful. So, I think of it as a healthy mix, but not over the top with fooling with every clone. I've got a very strong belief that with Cabernet Sauvignon in Napa Valley, the site trumps everything, and the obsession with clones is an obsession. And a site like this doesn't require that kind of fine tuning, if you will. I think that's the positive spin to put on it. So we've sort of steered away from making it way too complicated.
But you've got some other things there. You've got some Islay clone, as I recall, and some other things in the ranch, as I remember.
That would really be the only other thing that's here, other than what I mentioned. Yeah, so it's really clone 4, clone 7, a little bit of 337, a tiny block of the Islay, and now just a tiny little piece of clone 6.
Got it. And so I'm curious, Bruce and Mike, I mean, obviously you've farmed this vineyard now for decades. What do you see as the impact of climate change at Vine Hill Ranch over the last, 20 years or so? Has there been a significant shift, or is the site so strong that it kind of adapts to change? Or can you even it out through farming and irrigation and other practices?
Yes, to all of those.
Easy question.
Yeah, it has clearly gotten warmer. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But that afternoon breeze that Françoise described mitigates it in a lot of situations. And we, again, I'm going to wear out the word resilient, but I think that's the most important trait that we want in our vineyards. We do a lot of work with soil health, with making sure that the microbiome down there where the vines are really doing their work is healthy and diverse, and that they've got the ability to mine everything that they need from down there. I think the slightly bigger vines with the slightly bigger canopies provide a lot of flexibility for us to protect things from the sun. I'll give you actually a really good example that's really recent. Last year, Françoise and I talk a lot about, well, do you farm to last year? Everybody farms to last year, and we shouldn't. And this is a really good example of it. Last year, when we had 5 inches of rain in May, when we were doing our early season canopy work on the vines, we took off what for us is an unusual amount of foliage. We left the fruit really exposed really early on, having the sense that our issues during the season were going to be around the wet spring and excessive growth, huge disease pressure, all of that kind of stuff, and taking a little bit of a gamble, saying, okay, if it gets really hot in August, we've still got a canopy configuration that's going to provide us some shade. This year, with very shy rainfall and much more moderate growth, we're taking a much more moderate approach to that leaf removal and what we do in the fruit zone, still wanting it to be open, still wanting to have nice light exposure, but dialing it back a couple of notches. And it is a really, really strong site. And we've learned over the years, I think what we're experiencing more than an overall climate change, at least in the context of growing grapes, is we're experiencing these horrible hot spells. And trying to build a vineyard that's going to be able to withstand that. Without you know, it's about building the vineyard to withstand it, not about applying a whole bunch of extraneous tools to help it get through it. And this site is capable of doing that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think we spent a lot of time talking about the vineyard, so I'm sorry, Françoise, but
No,
you know,
it is. It's all about the vineyard. I think the
well,
winemaking
in fact,
project and the great ones is secondary. And, you know, you have a site like this and the wines, they kind of make themselves. Certainly 13 was a pretty easy growing season. There was only one real heat spike to think of, to talk about in June, beginning of July. But other than that, it was a really cool season. And it was early for us. So super even, no drama. But one of our earlier harvests, and I love the early harvests. I think the grapes just hold on to that freshness and acidity. The color on this wine in the tank just spilled right out, so we didn't have to work hard to extract. More the opposite, kind of had to put the brakes on a little bit.
yeah, I think that was typical of that vintage. But
Yeah.
on the subject of winemaking, I think a lot of times people have this image of Napa Valley wines that are made in these shiny new wineries and very high tech. And you know, one of the things about Vine Hill Ranch is it's made in with very sort of very manually. I mean, I do love tasting your young wines in the spring, but my second favorite tasting is going to taste the wines while they're still fermenting in the fall, which you can do if the year is a little bit young and I mean, if the year is a little bit early and I stay late enough in October, sometimes you taste the wines in the tank. And I think that one of the things that I always admire about these wines is that they're really handmade. I mean, you're working at a facility with very, you know, that would probably surprise most people by its just utilitarian sort of setup. So what's the approach to vinification for Vine Hill Ranch?
Well, we harvest every block individually and ferment them, you know, in individual tanks. We don't co-ferment necessarily, maybe a little bit of Petit Verdot, but the blocks are harvested and fermented on their own, usually cold soak for a week. And when we start harvesting for VHR, it's usually like a week window. And so things aren't all that fast when we bring them into the winery. It is very hands-on and we can do, you know, 4 tons a day comfortably. So I do like to cold soak, and I call it the pause button. Just get it in a tank, chill it, and then, you know, you have time to work on it again. So during fermentation, we'll pump over by hand. There's no iPad, there's no shiny buttons. We do a lot of splash tanks, and it's so fun to just touch the wines and to smell them and to taste them and to see them being pumped over. That's really a joy. For the more modern facilities, it's so hands off. I don't, you know, I come into a winery and the first thing I do is I touch the tank and it's like, oh, they're insulated and you don't get a feel of the wine. So yes, pretty honest winemaking approach, which I love, old school.
Yeah, it definitely comes through. We've got a couple of really great questions. I want to make sure we get them in. So Bruce, the first one is for you. A question from one of our viewers, which is, would VHR ever consider having a second wine?
That is a perennial question for this team.
For me.
Yeah, it honestly comes up at least once a year. We make far more wine than we bottle. The concern is we could certainly bottle something that would be delicious. The concern that I always have is that by moving down that route of a second or a companion bottle, could you run the risk of taking away from your primary offering, which is this wine? And the vision had always been to hold up a single wine that really was reflective of the essence of this vineyard. And it's a simple vision. I'd hate to move down a path where we have to support something that likely may have great commercial success or could have commercial success and then might compromise that decision. So to this point, we stay focused on one wine.
Yeah, I mean, having had a chance to taste a lot of your wines in multiple vintages now, pretty much since the beginning in the component lots. I mean, I've written this before, so you've already heard it, but I think that the wines you don't bottle are better than a lot of wines that people bottle.
Well, we're in a pretty spoiled position, and the blends that we bottle might represent 50 to 60% of what we bring in. But there are new blocks, like the one on the hill. They're very young. We want to learn from them. So we bring them in, we ferment them, we make wine from them just to start the learning process, but they're too young to go into a VHR blend. So it's entertainment.
Yeah. We have a question from Michael, which is, are there any blocks that have been in every single vintage of Vinehill Ranch?
Yeah, the block 6L and 6M and block 4 have been in every single vintage. I think those are the only ones that have been in the wine since the very beginning.
Yeah.
And still
All right. So we're almost up against our time limit, but we have, there's one question I want to ask each of you, same question, which you may not want to answer, but it's okay, which is which is your favorite vintage of the ones that you've made so far and why? Françoise, you go first.
Oh my goodness. 2010, I think. And it has a lot of similarities for me than the 13, but I like how tightly wound it is. I like the energy of it and the expressive nature of Vinehill. Yeah.
Bruce, what about you?
Of the forest, of the fruit, of just floral. It's kind of.
Okay.
For me, 08 certainly is near and dear to my heart, only because it was our first. But top of mind, I think 12 and 14 and even 16, just for the pure pleasure that those vintages bring in terms of breadth and opulence. So those are the ones I would hold up.
Okay. Mike?
For me, it's 2011.
Oh, thank God. I'm glad you said that.
And it's hard for me to separate, because 2011 was really, really difficult. And it's hard for me to separate what I really think of the wine from how proud I am of what we all did in those kind of conditions. So that one will probably always be my favorite. And hopefully we never have a year more difficult than that.
No,
Yeah.
I could totally do that vintage again. And to Mike's point, it's amazing what we pulled off in that vintage. His crew, I think we picked VHR in probably 2 days. And the wines, tasting them now, they are so beautiful. And they reflect not only Vinehill at a different volume, but also the vintage. And that's what VHR is all about.
Yeah, so for folks watching who may not remember, who are maybe newer to Napa Valley wines, that was a year that was very rainy and very cold, especially during the harvest. I remember it was like foggy and I mean, just bizarrely foggy, cold and rainy right in the middle of harvest. And I'm sure that that vintage gave you fits. I haven't tasted your 11 in a while, but I've tasted a lot of those wines. And yeah, I mean, the best of the wines are absolutely beautiful right now. And that vintage got really criticized when the wines were young. But I think over time, you really see the difference of place. I remember this tasting a few years ago. Steve Tanzer and I went to Harlan, to Bond, I should say, to Bond to be precise. We tasted every Bond wine that had ever been made. Every single one. It was like 60 wines. I don't think they had ever done that. I mean, the whole family was there. It was like the Godfather, you know, the whole family, La Familia. And the 11s, they were like, for all 5 wines, they were just like really, really terrific. And there you have the context of all these surrounding vintages, you know, so it really opened. I mean, I already kind of knew that the wines were, I mean, I already had always liked that vintage probably more than most people, but when you taste the context, it's really interesting. So now you have me interested, and I'm going to go find a bottle of 2011 Vinehill Ranch because I can't have that thought and not have it be satisfied. So now I have to think about that. So thanks for suggesting that. Thanks again for all 3 of you being here. It's a pleasure. I'm sorry we couldn't taste this year in person, but we'll make it up in the fall, I hope. Cheers.
Great weekend.
Yeah, bye.